McComb, Nonviolence and Armed Protection. Protection was also needed for the voter registration efforts in McComb. Moses and other SNCC organizers were given shelter and support from 3 black neighborhoods in McComb: Bergland, Algiers, and Burton. SNCC organizers were monitored and harassed by the local police and the Klan. Moses and his comrades depended on indigenous networks to avoid the surveillance and persecution of local white supremacists. The black-owned Noble Brothers Cleaners was one place of refuge in the Bergland community of McComb. Ernest Nobles was the primary owner of the Cleaners. Nobles was a World War II veteran, local NAACP leader, and one of the McComb business owners supporting the voter registration campaign. SNCC workers would enter the side entrance of Nobles Cleaners to evade the pursuit of white supremacists. They would hide behind the machinery or in the office of the cleaners. The cleaners' personnel would transport Moses and others away to safety in the company vehicle. Nobles Cleaners itself became a target for white. Ernest Nobles and his brothers kept weapons in the business for protection. A sentry was maintained at a black-owned taxi stand across the street from the Cleaners during times when hostilities increased in McComb. As white supremacists reacted to movement activities, Moses' voter registration efforts in McComb created opportunity for SNCC's Nonviolent Direct Action Wing to initiate activity in the state. Indeed, the emergent McComb movement would provide the first test for nonviolent direct action in Mississippi. In August of 1961, SNCC's Direct Action Wing sent Marion Barry to McComb to recruit and organize nonviolent confrontation. Barry, a veteran of nonviolent campaigns in Nashville, facilitated nonviolent workshops in McComb and organized local activists under the umbrella of the Pike County Nonviolent Movement. 2 local teenage males sat in at the segregated Woolworth's lunch counter in downtown McComb weeks after Barry's arrival in the city. The 2 young men, Hollis Watkins and Curtis Hayes, were SNCC's first 2 recruits in Mississippi. Watkins and Hayes were arrested after refusing to comply with police orders to move from the lunch counter. They were charged with breach of the peace and incarcerated for 34 days. The nonviolent campaign in McComb led to the involvement of high school students and arrest of local youth and SNCC activists engaged in direct action. Hollis Watkins exemplified the attitude of many Southern black youth toward nonviolence. Watkins grew up in the nearby county of Lincoln in the Chisholm Mission community. As in most rural black communities in the South, in Chisholm Mission, most households owned a rifle or shotgun for hunting and protection. Watkins himself carried a knife for protection. He was Moses' first recruit into the ranks of SNCC. Watkins wanted to see change in his local community, in the South, and throughout the United States. Watkins' family had to make choices due to his decision to participate in the McComb movement. After his arrest for participation in the inaugural McComb sit-in, white segregationists sent a local black man to Watkins' father offering money if his son left the movement. Watkins' parents were not responsive to the offer. In turn, the segregationists sent their black representative back to the Watkins household. He stated that the white supremacists threatened to set fire to the Watkins home and bring physical harm to the family patriarch. The elder Watkins replied that his son was old enough to make decisions for himself and that he was willing to retaliate against any intruders. The Watkins patriarch responded, if people want to meet him, he was prepared to meet them. Watkins was willing to try nonviolence, even though the philosophy was not consistent with his background or personal inclinations. He went through nonviolence training at Barry's McComb nonviolent workshops. But even after the training, he doubted he could be nonviolent if physically attacked at the Woolworth sit-in or any other nonviolent action. Because Watkins wanted to be involved in action to change his community, he subordinated his personal reservations and differences with pacifist activism and chose to participate in the nonviolent action at Woolworth's. However, he would never totally commit himself to nonviolence. His perspective reflected that of numerous grassroots Southerners of his generation who joined nonviolent organizations. Forrest County and Vernon Dahmer. Forrest County NAACP leader Vernon Dahmer made a request for SNCC workers to come to build a voter registration campaign there. In response to Dahmer's request, Watkins and Hayes were sent to Forrest County months after their release from the McComb jail and the decline of the Pike County campaign. Forrest County is located in the south-central Piney Woods region of Mississippi. Its county seat, Hattiesburg, had a population of around 35,000, with the black community comprising a third of the total. Hattiesburg was considered moderate as compared to other parts of the state, like Amite and the Delta, where blacks experienced violent terror. In spite of its reputation for moderation, however, Hattiesburg and Forrest County blacks still experienced apartheid segregation and denial of civil and human rights. Only 25 blacks were registered out of 7,495 persons of African descent eligible to vote. Vernon Dahmer had been a significant NAACP leader in Forrest County and the state since the early 1950s, when he achieved notoriety for suing the Forrest County Sheriff for preventing blacks from voting. Dahmer was born in 1908 in Kelly's Settlement, a small, rural Forrest County black community just northwest of Hattiesburg. The community was named for Dahmer's white great-grandfather, John Kelly. Dahmer was of multiracial heritage and could pass for white, but he had passionately identified with the black community and was a determined fighter, willing to use his resources for civil and human rights. Dahmer never completed high school, but was considered wealthy by the standards of his time and community. He owned a 200-acre commercial farm producing cotton and raising cattle, as well as a sawmill and a small grocery store. Dahmer's enterprises provided employment for many of Forrest County's black population. Dahmer requested that SNCC send personnel to invigorate Forrest County's voter registration campaign. He needed assistance to get the voter drive moving since most of his time was occupied running his enterprises. Watkins and Hayes relied on Dahmer for economic support. SNCC had only provided the two young activists with $50 to run a 3-month campaign. Watkins and Hayes lived with the Dahmer family, were employed at Dahmer's sawmill, and had the use of one of Dahmer's vehicles. Watkins considered Dahmer a real down-to-earth father. Dahmer provided the two activists with protection as well as economic subsistence. According to Watkins, there is no doubt about it, Vernon Dahmer believed in self-defense. The Dahmer residence was well armed with guns, pistols, and rifles, similar to the Evers and Steptoe households. Due to his vocal leadership of the Forrest County NAACP, he was targeted by state and local segregationist forces. Like Steptoe, Dahmer strategically had guns placed throughout his house. While living with the Forrest County farmer, Watkins observed Dahmer engaging in a unique practice. To warn potential night riders of his preparedness for attackers, Dahmer would ever so often, as he would go about his property, just take one of his guns and shoot in the air, just to let folks know he was alive, well, and intended to protect his property. Dahmer and his wife, Ellie, began to take turns sleeping at night to watch for intruders in response to anonymous threats received from white supremacists in 1961. For years, the Dahmers would maintain the practice of an evening watch for night riders. Dahmer also had a network of supporters who helped protect him and his family. This support network included other NAACP members and local business people. This network was involved in protecting voter registration activities in Forrest County. Vernon Dahmer, the Forrest County farmer who died after defending his home and family from night riders in 1966. Dahmer provided security for SNCC workers in his community. Getting the word out in Greenwood. SNCC personnel and energy shifted to the Mississippi Delta in 1962. The first SNCC organizer in the Delta was Sam Block. Block was recommended to Moses for the task of organizing in the Delta by Amesy Moore, who had known him most of his life. Block was a 23-year-old resident of Cleveland, Mississippi. His father was a construction worker and his mother was a maid. Block was an Air Force veteran and attended Mississippi Vocational College, now Mississippi Valley State, in the Delta town of Ida Ben. Block was assigned by Moses to organize a voter registration campaign in Leflore County. Leflore County and its county seat, Greenwood, would be the primary SNCC beachhead in the Delta. Greenwood was an important center of Mississippi's Delta cotton belt and a bastion of white supremacist power. With a population of 47,000, the Delta City was the state headquarters of the Citizens Council. Although LaFleur was a black majority county, with over 2/3 of the population being of African descent, it possessed only 250 black registered voters. 95% of LaFleur's eligible whites were registered, in contrast to only 2% of eligible blacks. Consequently, all of the elected officials were white in this black majority county. Poverty was also a significant issue in LaFleur County. The median income for whites was $5,200, while for blacks it was $1,500. White farmers also owned 90% of the county's land. Block arrived in Greenwood on June 18, 1962, and was identified and targeted by white supremacist forces within weeks of his arrival. In spite of being evicted from his initial meeting place and being homeless, Block was persistent, organizing Greenwood residents to register. His efforts led a group of 21 black Greenwood citizens to conquer fear and intimidation and go downtown to the LaFleur County courthouse to register. After being refused service by the registrar, Block and the group were confronted by the sheriff. The sheriff singled Block out, spat in his face, and told the young activist to get out of town. Block militantly responded, "If you don't want to see me here, I think the best thing for you to do is pack your clothes and leave. Get out of town." Block's courage inspired those with him. In the face of being harassed by police officers while leaving downtown, some of the would-be registrants retorted, "You don't scare me no more. You don't scare me no more." In the coming weeks, Block would return with other LaFleur blacks wishing to register. Block also became more of a target for local white supremacists and police by encouraging a young Greenwood black man to file charges of police brutality to federal officials. The SNCC activists submitted an affidavit, photos, and other evidence to the Department of Justice. Bob Moses commented that after Block's attempt to solicit federal intervention for this victim of police terror, from then on, it was Sam versus the police. White supremacists were angered by Block's courage and militancy. The level of terror increased from harassment to physical brutality. On August 13th, 3 white males accosted Block on a Greenwood street, forcing him into an alley, and beat him. SNCC soon sent reinforcements. Tougaloo College student Lawrence Guyot and 18-year-old SNCC Field Secretary LaVon Brown joined Block on August 16th, 3 days after Block was beaten. SNCC intentionally sent Guyot and Brown to Greenwood to communicate its resolve to the African American residents of LaFleur. White supremacists would again take terror to a new level. On the evening following Guyot and Brown's arrival, the SNCC workers were in their new office, located upstairs in a building in Greenwood's black community. Block and the new arrivals noticed 8 men leaving vehicles armed with shotguns, ropes, bricks, and chains. Block immediately called Department of Justice official John Dorr. While Dorr offered no immediate protection, he advised the activists to leave the office. Block, Brown, and Goyette escaped through the office bathroom window, climbed over the roof, and jumped to another roof to find refuge with a supporter in the black community of Greenwood. The Greenwood SNCC contingent returned the next day to find their office ransacked. Moses and a new comrade were waiting for them. Willie Peacock, a graduate of Rust College, located in Holly Springs, Mississippi, was another recruit of Amesy Moore. Local police would soon pressure the black owner of the building where SNCC's Greenwood office was located to evict the organization. SNCC workers rooted themselves in the Greenwood black community and slowly gained support in spite of the repression. The lack of resources and the fear of some LaFleur blacks of being associated with the movement. White supremacist attacks on SNCC voter registration workers in the Delta intensified in 1963. On February 28th, 3 white supremacists armed with a submachine gun and riding in a 1962 Buick carried out a drive-by shooting on Moses and 2 other activists. Moses and Randall Blackwell of the Voter Education Project were being driven by SNCC worker Jimmy Travis on their way from Greenwood to another Delta town, Greenville. This assault left SNCC activist Jimmy Travis wounded in his shoulder and in the back of his neck. Travis immediately received medical attention in Greenville. He was then taken to the Greenwood Hospital and finally to a Jackson hospital where the bullet lodged behind his spinal cord was removed. The shooting of Travis became a catalyst for the Lafleur County movement. Movement forces throughout the state and from the national leadership mobilized to Greenwood after this vicious attack. Voter Education Project Executive Director and Civil Rights Attorney Wally Branton made a call for all voter registration workers in the state to converge on Greenwood. SNCC voted for its entire Mississippi staff to answer Branton's call. Since 1962, SNCC, CORE, the NAACP, and the SCLC coordinated efforts in Mississippi through the umbrella of the Council of Federated Organizations, COFO. Other voter registration projects also sent reinforcements through the COFO vehicle. 1 month prior to the shooting of Travis, Bob Moses and 6 other Mississippi SNCC activists filed suit in Washington, D.C. against several Mississippi officials. The suit charged the state officials with responsibility for the violent acts directed against black Mississippians and movement activists. The complaint noted that President Kennedy and FBI Director J. Edgar Hoover had been consistently informed of the violence and harassment of local blacks and activists in the South in 1961 and 1962. The suit failed in court, and federal officials gave little indication that they were willing to intervene on the basis of legality, moral conscience, or goodwill. In March of 1963, white supremacist assaults on SNCC workers continued and intensified. Peacock, Block, and 2 other comrades, Essie Broom and Peggy Marne, were the targets of a terrorist attack on March 6th. The four activists were assaulted by shotgun blasts as they were parking in front of the SNCC office. Fortunately, they escaped with only minor cuts after night riders fired on their car. Greenwood Mayor Charles Sampson charged that SNCC created the incident to gain publicity for its campaign. On March 24th, terrorists set the SNCC office on fire, destroying all of the office equipment. The response to white terror increased again after night riders shot into the home of COFO worker and local NAACP president Dewey Green on March 26th. Green and his family were in the center of the Leflore County movement. Green's son, Dewey Jr., was Block's first Leflore County recruit. 4 children of the Green household were involved with COFO and the local voter registration campaign. One of them, George, returning home from a mass meeting, was nearly shot when night riders fired a shotgun blast, shattering a window in the house. The Green patriarch immediately contacted local law enforcement and communicated that he was armed and was prepared for anyone wishing to attack his household. Green warned if anybody else comes shooting at his house, the police could just come and collect the bodies. The attack on the well-liked Green family angered Greenwood's black community and sparked more Leflore County residents into action. SNCC Executive Secretary James Forman stated that many in the black community felt they had nothing to lose. They were ready to move. A large crowd gathered at Wesley Chapel Methodist Church the next morning. Angered by the attack on the Green household, Moses passionately exhorted the crowd to march to the Leflore County Courthouse camp downtown in honor of Green and his family, who had committed themselves to the voter registration campaign. Speaking after Moses, James Forman offered a different opinion. Forman called for the crowd to march to City Hall and demand that Greenwood's mayor utilize his authority to stop the violence against the black citizens of the city. The gathering enthusiastically supported both suggestions. Forman and Moses privately huddled and compromised. The demonstration would first go to City Hall and then to the courthouse to register to vote. Over 150 people participated in the march. Anyone participating had to commit to nonviolence. However, many local blacks were not willing to make that commitment. Hollis Watkins recalls, "Some of the local brothers and sisters said, 'I can't give up my stuff, so I won't be on the march. I'll just be on the side.'" The presence of armed bystanders accompanying nonviolent demonstrations was not isolated to Greenwood and would become a common occurrence during movement demonstrations. SNCC activists led other confrontational activism, including a demonstration and voter registration contingent to the Leflore County Courthouse. The SNCC strategy to force the federal government to take a side proved to be successful in the case of Greenwood. On March 31st, 5 days after the attack on the Green household, a federal district court ordered Greenwood officials to allow blacks to peacefully protest. The judge, responding to a Department of Justice petition, also ordered the release of incarcerated SNCC activists. Coverage of the police attacks on demonstrators from the New York Times and the Chicago Defender and other national media played a significant role in motivating the federal government to act. Local officials resisted federal intervention. The interned SNCC activist remained incarcerated. On April 3rd, 3 days after the injunction, Greenwood police prevented a small demonstration of 40 people from marching. 19 of the marchers were arrested. One local activist broke the vow of nonviolence during the confrontation between the marchers and the police. Mrs. Laura McGee defended herself after being shoved by a police officer's nightstick. McGee wrestled with the officer's nightstick. Entertainer and activist Dick Gregory had to restrain her from further action. Like the Green family, Laura McGee and her family were in the center of the Leflore County freedom movement. Mrs. McGee was a widow, a small farmer, and one of the first county residents to support the SNCC voter registration campaign in Leflore. She was the sister of Gus Courts, who was shot in Belzoni and ultimately exiled from Mississippi. McGee's land was used for voter registration classes, meetings, rallies, refuge for tenants, displaced for supporting the voter registration campaign, as well as collateral to bail out movement activists. The McGee family was reputed to take no shit, while they also gave shit out. Mrs. McGee was a clear example of the fact that the black armed resistance tradition was not exclusively male. She was an active participant in the defense of her household and property. Mrs. McGee would sleep in the day so that she could conduct a watch from her porch at night, armed with a Winchester rifle. Her sons Silas, Jake, and Clarence were also active in the voter registration campaign and, like their mother, actively defended their family. One evening, after an explosion from a cherry bomb, the McGee brothers witnessed night riders leaving the area. The night riders shot the McGee family dog as it ran toward the car. The McGee sons fired their weapons at and hit the marauders' vehicle as it left their property. The FBI and the Leflore sheriff came to the McGee matriarch to demand that their sons not shoot at intruders. According to historian Charles Payne, who interviewed Laura McGee, she told them not to worry, she'd do all the rest of the shooting herself. Local police presented themselves as the primary nemesis to nonviolent demonstrators in Greenwood direct action demonstrations. In other southern cities and towns, white civilians attacked human rights demonstrations that occurred in the spring of 1963. Hollis Watkins analyzed that once the word got out that there were armed black bystanders at marches and demonstrations, it served to prevent violence by civilians. Watkins argued that due to the presence of armed blacks, the police had to worry about making sure these crazy white folks don't come and attempt to do nothing, because some of them could be killed in the process. Local law enforcement discouraged white terrorism to prevent the loss of white life and the escalation of violence. The police did not respond when SNCC workers were shot at and harassed. However, after blacks like Dewey Green and Laura McGee vocally announced they would meet violence with violence, and the word got out that there were covert armed black protection at the nonviolent marches, police attempted to deter white civilian terrorism. The federal government and Greenwood officials reached a compromise on April 3rd. The Department of Justice compromised on its initial position by rescinding its injunction against the Greenwood government. In turn, the local Greenwood authorities agreed not to press charges against those in the initial arrest on March 27th. This grant of amnesty did not apply to Laura McGee and the 18 other activists arrested on April 3rd. Greenwood officials and local segregationists viewed the compromise as a victory, as they had successfully resisted Northern liberal and black agitators. The compromise was a blow to the notion that the federal government could be relied upon to neutralize the power of white supremacy and apartheid in the South. The Kennedy administration succumbed to pressure from the segregationist U.S. senators from Mississippi, James Eastland and John Stennis. The Kennedy government did not want to alienate white Southerners while making overtures to potential black voters. The Department of Justice compromise was viewed as a sellout by movement activists and the Greenwood black community. The ambivalence of the federal government would eventually have an effect on the commitment to tactical nonviolence and the anticipation of federal intervention to curtail white supremacist violence, whether state or civilian. Some in the movement would be convinced of the necessity to rely on their own resources to sustain and protect the black community, including armed self-defense. Just protecting my wife and family, Holmes County and Hartman, Turnbow. Directly south of LaFleur is Holmes County. Black residents of Holmes County traveled to Greenwood to support the civil rights demonstrations and make contacts with the movement. Holmes also possessed a black majority, with people of African descent constituting 72% of the population. The western quarter of Holmes County is Delta country, physically, politically, and culturally. In keeping with the political culture of the rest of the Delta region, people of African descent were denied the right to vote, in spite of Holmes' black majority. Holmes' higher percentage of black-owned farms made it unique compared to other Delta counties. Black land ownership increased in the early 1940s due to two developments in the county. First, black World War II veterans utilized the GI Bill to purchase land to increase their personal economic independence. Secondly, 107 tenant families were able to purchase 9,850 acres of Delta farmland in the Mileston County on long-term, low-interest loans through a New Deal program, the Farm Security Administration. SNCC was invited to initiate a voter registration campaign in Holmes after local residents visited Greenwood. SNCC sent John Ball to initiate a voter registration school there. The Mileston farming community provided the location, and most of the participants in the Holmes County voter registration school. Mileston, a community of independent black landowners, would become one of the haven communities in Mississippi. SNCC and other activists could venture to Mileston for protection and refuge from hostile white terror. 14 Holmes County blacks went to downtown Lexington, the Holmes County seat, and attempted to register on April 9, 1963. This group consisted primarily of black landowners over the age of 40. The group was met at the courthouse by County Sheriff Andrew Smith, county and city police, as well as nearly 30 deputized whites. Smith and his armed contingent attempted to intimidate the group through a show of force. The sheriff cursed and shouted at the group while slapping one hand on his sidearm and the other on his club. A black farmer named Hartman Turnbow humbly appealed that the group was only here to vote, to register. Seeking to avoid publicity or federal intervention, Smith decided to comply with Turnbow's request and barked, "Who will be first?" Turnbow was the first to respond, and one by one the group entered to apply. Turnbow and one other farmer, John Wesley, were allowed to take the complicated Mississippi voter registration test. Wesley and Turnbow failed the test, and the other 12 applications were denied. The group was encouraged that it survived the ordeal, seeing it as the beginning of a long struggle. The white supremacist forces in Holmes would respond swiftly to this violation of the institution of apartheid and white supremacy. The names of each of the 14 who sought registration were published in the local newspaper. Reverend Nelson Trent, who was part of the group, left town after being threatened by local police. One Holmes County activist recalled that Trent was given 30 minutes to get out of town. Hartman Turnbow was identified as the leader of the group due to his willingness to humbly ask to register and go first. Turnbow was named in the local press as an integration leader. 1 month after the journey to Lexington, on May 8, 1963, night riders tossed Molotov cocktails and shot several rounds into the home of Hartman Turnbow in the hamlet of Tchula. The night riders waited for Turnbow to escape from the front of his burning house so they could assassinate him. Turnbow's wife and daughter escaped the burning house first and were not harmed by the night riders. Turnbow emerged from the burning house with his 16-round .22 semi-automatic rifle. The night riders fired at Turnbow and he returned the fire, expending every round. Turnbow's response forced the terrorists to retreat. Holmes County blacks believed that Turnbow shot and killed one of the night riders. But to protect the identity of the terrorist, local authorities claimed the cause of death was a heart attack. The Turnbow family turned their attention to putting out the fire, and the house was saved, in spite of severe damage. Turnbow was arrested the following day on charges of arson by Sheriff Smith. Local authorities accused Turnbow of setting his own home on fire to work up sympathy and excitement for the voter registration campaign. Bob Moses and 3 other SNCC workers came the next morning to investigate the attack on the Turnbow home. Moses and his comrades were immediately arrested for obstructing the sheriff's investigation by taking pictures of the crime scene. Due to federal intervention charges against Turnbow, and the SNCC activists were dropped 6 months after the arrest. Turnbow's successful defense of his life and his inspirational leadership made him a legendary figure within the Holmes County black community and the Mississippi movement. Similar to militant grassroots leaders like Steptoe, Dahmer, Green, and McGee, Turnbow won the admiration and respect of young SNCC activists. It was widely known within the movement that Turnbow did not practice or advocate nonviolence. According to Charles Cobb, Turnbow would joke about his act of armed resistance in defense of his family and home. He was known to say, "I wasn't being nonviolent. I was just protecting my family, my wife and family." In one interview, Turnbow took pride in the fact that he publicly disagreed with Martin Luther King Jr.'s advocacy of nonviolence on 2 occasions. At a meeting during the 1964 Democratic Convention, Turnbow made the following response to statements by King. "This nonviolent stuff ain't no good. It'll get you killed." The same day, Turnbow told a young female activist, "Ever what the Mississippi white man posed with, he got to be met with. Meet him with ever he posed with. If he posed with a smile, meet him with a smile. And if he posed with a gun, meet him with a gun." Turnbow generally came to SNCC COFO meetings with a briefcase that concealed his .38 handgun. The titular farmer exhorted, "This handgun is for folks who might try and come here and do something to us. They ain't gonna come up in here and take us. Not as long as I'm here and alive." In spite of white violence and intransigence, Turnbow and the black community of Holmes would continue their fight for basic civil and human rights. The Holmes County movement was very self-reliant and maintained its momentum after COFO SNCC organizers relocated to other counties. Holmes County became a significant base for the Mississippi movement. The Mileston farming community was particularly important to the maintenance of the movement. Part of Mileston's significance was its ability to provide a protective ring around its community. The armed presence of independent black farmers in Holmes County was greatly appreciated by activists committed to nonviolence. From their experiences in Pike and Lafleur counties, many SNCC and COFO activists were beginning to believe that federal law enforcement could not be relied upon for protection. Corps in Canton, protected by badass CO Chinn. Corps also experienced challenges to its nonviolent philosophy in the rural Deep South. SNCC, the first organization to apply Gandhian principles to the Mississippi anti-apartheid movement, engaged black Southerners who practiced armed self-defense as a way of life. Corps organizers would also rely upon rural blacks for protection. Corps sent its first full-time organizer to Mississippi in 1962. A veteran of the Freedom Rides, New Orleans Corps member Dave Dennis went to Mississippi as Corps' sole representative in the state. His presence in the state was initially facilitated by a voter education project grant shared by Corps, SNCC, and the NAACP. Dennis would convince Corps to allow him to continue in Mississippi after the grant ended. He traveled to communities around the state involved in voter registration. Dennis became one of the COFO's principal leaders. As co-chair, along with Bob Moses, CORE assumed responsibility to organize COFO's voter registration project in Mississippi's 4th Congressional District, which primarily consisted of 5 central Mississippi counties: Madison, Rankin, Leake, Neshoba, and Lauderdale. Similar to his comrades in SNCC, Dennis and the group of people he organized became targets of harassment and white terrorism. The young organizer appealed to others in CORE to join him in the fight for voting rights in Mississippi. Another Freedom Rider and New Orleans CORE member, George Raymond, was sent to Mississippi to join Dennis in 1963. Dennis felt that Madison County and its county seat of Canton had good potential as a CORE base. Blacks constituted nearly 75% of the county's population and owned 40% of the land in Madison. In spite of their numbers and economic strength, blacks were denied the right to vote. Less than 200 people of African descent were registered to vote. Less than 200 people of African descent from a population of 29,000 blacks. While blacks controlled a significant amount of the county's land, their economic independence was very limited. Cotton was the primary crop of the county, as in the Delta region, and cotton production was subsidized by the federal government. State officials determined which farmers would receive federal allotment, and due to racial discrimination, black farmers rarely received allowances. Madison County's black farmers also found themselves constantly in debt, often having to pledge their crop in advance. Despite their large numerical majority and the percentage of black-owned land, Madison County's blacks found themselves in the status of second-class citizens. Madison also provided the movement with Tougaloo College as a resource. Tougaloo was a private black institution located in the southwest corner of the county. It was an important recruiting zone for the Mississippi Black freedom struggle. George Raymond came to Canton, the county seat of Madison, in June of 1963. Raymond had participated in the Freedom Rides and had organized in the Mississippi Delta before coming to Madison. Dennis described Canton as a hotbed area, like the Old West. In 1963, Canton was a frontier town controlled by a segregationist white elite and enforced by a strongman, Sheriff Billy Noble. Noble fulfilled all the stereotypes of a white Southern sheriff. He was brash and brutal and a staunch segregationist. Any movement activism in Madison would find Noble a formidable adversary. The survival of CORE and the movement in Madison depended on the involvement and support of a man whose reputation was at least as formidable as Billy Noble's. Badass C.O. Chinn fit the description. Chinn developed his reputation before the movement came to Canton. When he was confronted, a white planter who made demands that he work on a white-owned plantation, see Chapter 1. As a young adult, Chinn participated in the U.S. military. Ironically, he served in the same military with Sheriff Noble. Upon leaving the military, Chinn and his young wife, Minnie, began to build their family in Canton. He became an enterprising businessman, opening a cafe and bar and bootlegging liquor on the side. The white power structure and noble did not interfere with Chinn's legal or illegal enterprises, allowing him the space to exist. In return, Chinn paid a tribute to the local white elite in order to operate his illegal alcohol business. As in other Mississippi towns, George Raymond and Core were avoided by local people when they initially came to Canton. Most Canton black citizens feared reprisal from Canton's white power structure. Chinn made a decision to embrace Raymond, and doors began to open for Raymond after the well-respected Chinn's endorsement of the young activist. Chinn's embrace of Raymond and Core extended beyond his endorsement and goodwill. Core was able to utilize office space in the Chinn Cafe, and Chinn also provided Core workers with transportation and protection. He began to use his connections to get Core forums at churches and other public gatherings, and often spoke in support of the voting rights campaign. In response to his support for Core activism, Chinn was targeted for economic reprisal and political repression by local white supremacists. The cordial relationship that had developed between Chinn and Noble since their days in the military soured after Chinn openly supported Core. He eventually lost his liquor license and was forced to close his bar. C.O. Chinn is a legendary figure in the history of Mississippi black freedom struggle. If Billy Noble was a stereotypic white Southern sheriff, Chinn was definitely the quintessential crazy Negro. He certainly did not fit the stereotype of servile and deferential behavior that has been identified with Southern blacks of his generation. He crossed lines that other blacks only dreamed of crossing. He was revered by the local blacks and feared by local whites. Chinn also did not fit most popular images of a Southern civil rights leader. He was not a clergyman or an idealistic intellectual, like many of the personalities projected as leaders of the civil rights movement in the popular narrative. When Chinn was a Christian, his lifestyle could not be confused with that of a devout religious leader or layperson. In fact, his wife, Mrs. Minnie Chinn, who also loved and respected her husband, described Chinn as a devil. Black people in Madison County respected Chinn because he openly spoke his mind and was not intimidated by white racists. Chinn's moral authority in the black community was based on his courage and willingness to openly oppose the white power structure. Chinn was also respected by blacks because whites, including the police and the white power structure, actually feared him. Core activist Matthew Suarez remembered that every white man in the town knew that you did not fuck with C.O. Chinn. Chinn also received respect and special treatment from Billy Noble and the police that was not afforded to other local blacks. According to Core leader Rudy Lombard, the intimidating Noble would taunt black protesters, yelling, "Ain't but two bad sons of bitches in this county, me and that nigger C.O. Chinn," Lombard recalls. They treated him and they approached him very gingerly. They would ask for his permission to proceed or to talk to him or to do something that he might consider a violation of his space or his rights. It is also suggested by many movement activists that Billy Noble was the only Madison County official that Chinn would allow to arrest him. One observer claimed that when a young deputy attempted to arrest Chinn, the black activist apparently laughed at the youthful deputy and demanded that if he was to be arrested, only Billy Noble could arrest him. The young officer left and returned with Noble. Noble took off his gun and told Chinn that if he could whip him hand to hand, Chinn would not be arrested. If Chinn lost the battle, he was expected to go to jail. Movement veterans claimed this scenario occurred several times, with the sheriff winning some of the matches, but Chinn often emerging as the victor. Corps workers' admiration for Chinn parallels the respect SNCC workers had for Steptoe, Dahmer, McGee, and Turnbow. According to Dave Dennis, Chinn was assertive, aggressive, and didn't take no shit. Corps activist Ann Moody recalled. He, Chinn, was the type of person that didn't take shit from anyone. If he was with you, he was all for you. If he didn't like you, that was it. He was in position to speak his mind. Chinn's reputation was an asset for Corps' organizing effort. His intervention often struck fear into local whites, preventing them from attacking Corps' activists. At times, Chinn openly carried a handgun on his person, which was legal in Mississippi. Chinn was also the inspirational leader of a group of protective guys who provided armed security for Corps and other voter registration workers. Corps workers realized that Chinn not only provided them legitimacy in order to speak to the community, but also acted as the catalyst to a local network that provided protection from night riders. According to Lombard, Chinn wasn't solo. He was just the inspirational leader. He gave other people heart and the courage to step to it. Chinn's protective guys and other defensive networks of this period were informal, not structured, and organized paramilitary groups, as Lombard explains. There were no organized groups that were professionally committed to self-defense, but there were these individuals and their friends who took it on themselves to do it without publicizing it, without serving public notice in any way whatsoever. They just did it as a matter of a part of the way they normally lived. In the Mississippi movement, organizing paramilitary groups dedicated to armed self-defense were not common in the late 1950s and early 1960s. On the other hand, Lombard argued that Chinn, his colleagues, and other informal networks in the South would serve as the inspiration for and as forerunners of the subsequent development of such militant paramilitary formations in the later period as the Deacons of Defense and Justice and the Black Panthers. Besides the network of protective guys, Chinn's defiant attitude inspired support for the movement and a growing militancy in certain working class and poor communities. Similar to Haven communities in Walthall, Mileston, and Danville, Virginia, certain Canton neighborhoods were feared by local whites. Dennis remembered black folks said, "You night riders don't come into this area." With this in mind, the Corps Freedom House was strategically located across the street from a housing project. The residents of the project organized to protect Corps workers and the Freedom House. Local people even provided nonviolent Corps workers with a rifle to protect themselves. Closing Chinn's business was not enough for the segregationists. After warnings and economic reprisal, Chinn refused to bend or compromise and remained an inspiration to movement forces and the black community. The Corps voter registration campaign was beginning to develop steam, recruiting young people and winning the support of adults. Less than a month after the campaign began, in late June 1963, 12 blacks succeeded in registering in 1 week. Another 18 blacks were turned away by county officials. It was obvious to the white power structure that Chinn's presence and influence had to be neutralized. Chinn was stopped by police while driving his pickup truck one summer evening in 1963. Police observed Chinn's .45 caliber automatic handgun on the front seat of the truck, which was legal by Mississippi law. Chinn was arrested on felony charges of carrying a concealed weapon, was convicted, and spent 6 months in prison. In spite of Chinn's internment, the Canton movement continued, and new leaders like former schoolteacher Annie Devine joined the registration campaign. To exist and to mobilize the black population of Canton and Madison County, Corps had to rely on indigenous blacks who were immersed in the black armed resistance tradition. Corps also would come across other local movement activists who utilized armed self-defense in the Harmony community of Leake County and in the city of Meridian, and would rely on them for protection. This was ironic since Corps pioneered the concept and practice of nonviolence in the struggle for black human rights. The reality of danger in Mississippi and the example of Chinn and the black community of Canton did create a debate within the Corps staff in Canton about the necessity of arming themselves. This debate within an organization that was so committed to nonviolence is a compelling statement of the influence and persuasiveness of the armed resistance tradition within the South, particularly in rural communities. Initial engagement, nonviolence, and the armed resistance tradition. SNCC and Corps' initial experience in Mississippi illuminates the existence and role of the armed eye for an eye tradition in the Deep South. Significant local leaders and or contiguous neighborhoods that practice armed self-defense were present in virtually every community SNCC and Corps organized. Nonviolent activists encountered and received protection from informal community networks of blacks in Walthall, LaFleur, Madison, and Holmes counties. Indigenous Mississippi black leaders, Medgar Evers, E.W. Steptoe, Ernest Noble, Vernon Dahmer, Hartman Turnbow, C.O. Chinn, Dewey Green, and Laura McGee were clearly not nonviolent. It was difficult for young, nonviolent activists to challenge the practice of armed self-defense in black Mississippi communities. First, many of the activists from organizations committed to nonviolence depended on black people who were immersed in the eye for an eye tradition for survival and protection. Secondly, SNCC and Corps began to recruit young black Mississippians like Hollis Watkins, MacArthur Cotton, and Ann Moody, who grew up familiar with the armed resistance tradition within their local communities. These two factors would have a major impact on the perspectives concerning the utility of nonviolence in the civil rights movement. SNCC and CORE would move from compromise with the eye for an eye tradition to debate within their organizations over support for the right of armed self-defense.